Welcome to Joy Recovery Radio. This is an educational podcast about betrayal trauma, deceptive sexuality, and the integrity work required when a relationship has been harmed by hidden sexual behavior. You might be here because you're trying to understand what happened in your relationship, or you might be here because you're trying to figure out what comes next. Either way, there's a place for you in this conversation. We talk about betrayal and recovery in a way that honors both what was lost and what might be rebuilt. You're invited to listen slowly, take what resonates, and leave the rest. Let's begin.
I want to start with a message that we received. I'm going to read it to you almost word for word. With permission, I'm going to call the writer Daniel. Last night, my wife called me a monster for what I did, and she meant it. She looked me in the eye and she said, "What you did was wicked, and I think you are a monster." I've been sober and honest with her for 11 months now. I did a full disclosure. I've done everything the program and my therapist has asked. And I stood there in the kitchen and everything in me wanted to fight back. I did not yell, but I did get defensive. And that is called abuse in your framework. I listed to her my 11 months like it was some kind of resume, and it got worse from there fast. So my question is this: how does any man just stand there and take something like that? And honestly, isn't there a point where her words become abuse against me? So Daniel asked two questions. How do I stand there? And basically, is this fair? Or even, is this abuse? Most of the men I coach don't lose the battle when it comes to acting out. That war is often being fought and won. They lose it in the kitchen, like Daniel, in the half second after she says something really hard. So let's take that half second apart. Let's talk about how do we dismantle defensiveness. Let's talk about what just happened in Daniel's body when she called him a monster. Researchers who study emotion draw a very specific, hard line between the two emotions of guilt and shame. And that line explains almost everything about what happened in the kitchen that day. Researcher June Tangney spent a career studying those two emotions that most people get confused, guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did a bad thing. It's about behavior. Shame says, I am a bad thing. It's about our being, our self, our personhood. Across study after study, guilt motivates repair behavior. That is, the guilty person moves towards the person they harmed. They move towards the damage. They apologize. They fix. They make amends. They repair. Shame is just the opposite. In fact, there are 4 different predictable moves that shame makes. And I encourage you to memorize these. Number 1, hide. Number 2, attack. Now that attack is actually 2 behaviors, because it can be attack self or it could be attack others. And then fourthly, defend. There can be the same event, the same offense, the same wrongdoing that you did, but there could be opposite trajectories, opposite emotions. And that fork in the road is whether the verdict lands on your behavior or on your being. Now, when Daniel's wife reaches for her biggest words, whatever those words are in their relationship that's going to convey the most meaning to Daniel, they land on his sense of self. It feels like what researchers would call social rejection. And here's what the literature says about rejection. Naomi Eisenberger ran experiments where people got excluded from a really simple game. It was a ball-tossing computer game. And the control group that got excluded from that game were measured lying in a scanner, looking at different regions of the brain. And the region that lit up when they were rejected overlapped with the same circuitry in the brain for physical pain. What the findings suggest is this: when we feel rejected, it runs on the same hardware in our brain as physical pain. So when a man like Daniel says that her words hit him like a knife, that's closer to reality and the literature than it is a metaphor. And it explains why his body answers language like that with the same reflex as if she had a knife. Now listen to the sentence that Daniel's wife said. "You are a monster. You're evil. You're wicked." That is being language. It doesn't stop at his behavior. It goes all the way down to Daniel's existence as a person. And your body has a primal policy about attacks on its existence. It treats them like a knife. Your body reacts, and that reaction is automatic before any thought arrives for you. So when Daniel recited his 11 months like it was a resume, his body had already, in a split second, convened a courtroom in that kitchen. And his recovery was Exhibit A in a trial that wasn't on the calendar. His body convened a courtroom in the time it took her to finish her sentence. Look, man, I get it. I really do. Every man listening has felt that courtroom. And every man, including me, is going to feel the reflex of defensiveness if we're called a monster, if our being is being attacked. So is the reflex wrong? No. That reflex is human. A body that flinches at a knife is a body that is properly working. It's what you build on top of that reflex in the half second after the reflex. That's where integrity is determined. That's where everything matters. That reflex asks nothing of you, but the half second afterwards asks everything of you. Why did Daniel mention his recovery resume like he did? The answer to that is about 70 years old in the research. Leon Festinger was the first that describes what happens when a brain holds two different competing beliefs at the same time that are incongruent. Here's the two beliefs. I'm a good person, but I did something bad. That collision has a genuine physiology of discomfort, and the brain resolves it in the most efficient way available, which is almost never revising belief number one, I'm a good person. It edits belief number two, I did something bad. How does it edit it? Our brain minimizes it, contextualizes it, outsources it out. Two social psychologists, Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson, wrote a whole book on this body of research. The title alone is worth the price of getting the book. The book is called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. In that book, they talk about self-justification. Self-justification is that good person belief, defending itself below the surface. And it comes out of your mouth sounding like you are simply correcting the record, which is why Daniel's mind looked for evidence to counter the notion that he is a monster. His brain archive did the selecting automatically, and it was instant.
Do you want to go deeper with teaching like what you're hearing today? That's why we created the Joy Recovery Academy. The Academy is our flagship educational space, designed to help you make sense of betrayal trauma, integrity abuse, and what real recovery actually looks like. This is where clarity replaces confusion and where you finally get a map for your recovery, for both the betrayer and the betrayed. The Academy includes live teaching with Q&A twice a week, and every live teaching is available anytime in our on-demand video library in case you can't make the live event. The Academy also features hundreds of the same tools and resources that we use with our private coaching clients. Right now, you can get the first 7 days free, so you can check it out and see if it is what you're looking for. Go to joy-recovery.com, click Academy, and join us today.
Let's take a moment like this and let's slow it down to slow motion so you can watch what happens inside of men like Daniel. She says, "You're a monster." The very first move we have is some kind of physical response. We flinch, our chest gets tight, our jaw is set, perhaps our breathing changes. That is all the same pain hardware in the brain. And you don't choose it. It's automatic. The second move is our memory archive lights up. Your brain starts pulling files. Now, wait a minute. I gave her flowers on Tuesday. I booked her therapy session for her. I rubbed her back the other day. That retrieval, it's also automatic. Anytime our brain feels threatened, it hunts for evidence. Just the same way a startled deer will hunt for some kind of exit. The third move is the mouth opens and says something. That action belongs to Daniel. Everything before the mouth was a reflex, but the mouth is a choice. And this whole teaching today lives in that one choice. So, just for review, there's a pain reflex. Then the brain archive seeks evidence, contrary to what she just said. Those two are reflexes. You can't help them. But the third, you speak. That's a choice. Before we go on, there's one more detail in our response that I want to highlight when we feel like we are being attacked, our being, our personhood. And social psychologists have measured this for 50 years under a specific label. It's called actor, observer, asymmetry. It goes like this. I judge myself by my intentions and my circumstances because I have full access to both of those. But I judge you by your behavior because that's all I can see. So, when you look at a betrayed marriage through that lens of asymmetry, he has access not just to his behavior and his intentions and his circumstances, but the research says every human runs the same asymmetry. The work for us men is knowing that you're running it when you open your mouth. Let me widen the lens for just a second. I mentioned shame, and shame exits that deserve some attention. The first exit is hiding. We may hide in the garage or hide behind some kind of screen. Or there's this suddenly urgent errand that we need to run. Or we start working later. Exit 2 from shame is attack. And it usually is some form of a countercharge to our wife. Well, what about the way you talk to me and disrespect me in front of the kids? What we're doing is we're flipping the role. Now we're the victim, and we put her on trial. And what is her crime? Her crime is prosecuting you. But exit 3 is the one Daniel took in the kitchen. Defense. The resume, the timeline, the character witnesses is almost never exclusively a marriage behavior. It's a lifestyle. It has a marriage chapter to it. One client of mine tracked his defensive 7 times a day getting defensive, mostly to people in his life who didn't have any power or authority over him. A waiter, a guy at the gym. He even got defensive at his own reflection one time, out loud in his truck. The kitchen is not where the habit lives, but the kitchen is where the habit gets very expensive for us. Watch what defensiveness actually is when it comes out of a man's mouth. It's an objection or a clarification. It's mitigating circumstances. 11 months of sobriety and honesty is now entered into evidence. All of this is courtroom behavior. A defensive man has turned his kitchen into a trial, appointed his wife as prosecutor, and now he's taken the stand in his own defense. And here's the reality of that courtroom. You can win every argument in it and lose your marriage, because every verdict that you win for yourself is a verdict against her testimony. That's why we say you are still contesting her reality when you get defensive. It's the same move that the basement had for years. I want to make a point that defensiveness actually destroys. And the reason this point is so expensive is a man like Daniel wants to know, why should I give up the defensiveness? What is it actually costing me? I want to know the cost before I give it up. So let's price it in a couple of different spaces. The first space, a lab. John Gottman spent decades wiring couples with sensors like heart rate and skin conductors, the works, and actually filming them argue in an apartment laboratory. Out of that program came his famous list of the 4 ways of communicating that were most toxic to a marriage. You've probably heard of them. He called them the Four Horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And by the way, he found defensiveness in 80% of the men that he studied, whether there was betrayal or not. Let's look at defensiveness. It's on the apocalypse list by empirical observation in a lab with instruments to prove it. Gottman's team became famous because they were spooky accurate at predicting divorce from a very short sample of conflict. I'm talking 90% accurate in his lab studies. And defensiveness was extremely influential in that prediction. Now the second space I want to look at how defensiveness destroys. The airline industry, the cockpit. Because an entire industry once had Daniel's problem, defensiveness, and they solved it. And the solution is on record. December 1978, United Flight 173. It was a DC-8 circling Portland because the landing gear light was acting up. The captain was experienced, respected, and he was absolutely certain. He was fixated on the gear problem while the fuel was running empty. His flight engineer could see the fuel gauge, and the voice recorder records the engineer raising it the way a lot of subordinates raise things to a respected authority. He would make hints. The recording has him saying, 15 more minutes is going to really run us low on fuel. He never said, sir, we're going to crash. The captain, busy being right about the landing gear, doesn't take the hint from the engineer, and the plane tragically runs out of gas and comes down in a suburb. 10 people dead with fully functioning landing gear. Nothing wrong, except fuel that got argued away by a man's defensiveness who was certain that he was right. Now, here's why I tell you that story. The airline industry's response was a training revolution called crew resource management. And at its center is a piece of engineering that should sound familiar by now. They didn't redesign the plane. they redesigned the captain. Captains were retrained to receive challenges without defensiveness, to treat a concern of someone on the crew as data instead of an attack or insubordination. And crews were trained to boldly speak plainly instead of going into silence or hinting and suggesting. Aviation looked at the data and concluded that the defended ego of the captain in charge was a fatality risk, so they engineered it out of the cockpit. Men, your home runs on the same exact physics. A defensive man who is certain he is right can destroy and burn the whole house to the ground. Third space, hospital. For decades, the standard playbook when medicine harmed a patient was called deny and defend. Admit nothing, disclose nothing, let the lawyers absorb it. Then the University of Michigan's health system tried an experiment and did the opposite. Instead of deny and defend when they made a mistake, they practiced full disclosure when they made a mistake, a genuine apology, and a proactive offer to make it right with the patient. The defense bar predicted this is going to be a feeding frenzy. The published results showed actually claims went down, not up. Legal costs went down. Cases were resolved faster. And buried in that research is the finding that should reorganize every man's assumptions about his wife. What injured people, like patients in a hospital, mostly wanted was acknowledgement of what happened and evidence that it wouldn't happen again. The defensive institution paid more for years to protect itself from people who mainly needed the truth acknowledged and repair attempts made. I want you to consider that in light of your marriage. One more space. This is the factory floor. I love this one. It's about Toyota. Toyota built its production system around a cord that hangs right above the assembly line. It's called the Andon cord. And any worker, I mean any employee, can pull that cord and stop the production line when something looks wrong. In most of manufacturing history, stopping the line was a fireable offense. And hiding any defect was survival for the employee. So what happened? Defects rode down that assembly line all the way to the customer. Toyota inverted the incentives. Someone who pulled that cord gets thanked. The problem gets swarmed and analyzed. And the company, Toyota, that institutionalized welcoming the bad news, became the most studied manufacturer on the planet. Now put the Andon cord in your marriage. When your wife raises that alarm, she's pulling the cord. When she shares her pain, she's pulling the cord. A defensive man treats that pull as the problem. A healthy man treats that pull as the most valuable information of the day and thanks his wife for having the courage to pull it. I have actually assigned some of my clients this sentence. Thank you for sharing your feedback with me. Feedback is golden. It reveals our blind spots, and we all have blind spots. You'll notice a pattern across all four spaces: aviation, medicine, manufacturing, and Gottman's lab. What do they have in common? All converge on the same design principle from four different directions, four different industries. The systems that thrive are the ones that make it possible to receive bad news and make it costly to hide it. All of those fields engineered around defensive human behavior, which is exactly what the protocol that I'm going to show you right now does for you. We've made the case that defensiveness destroys. One of the things that you can do that also comes from John Gottman is when you feel the impulse to defend yourself, stop and look for what he calls the kernel of truth. That is, if your wife is sharing her pain, an observation, feedback, even a complaint, instead of interpreting it as an attack on your being, if you will pause and find the 5%, the 10%, the 20% of what she is sharing that is true, the kernel of truth, that part of what she's sharing that you can authentically take ownership for. And instead of focusing on the parts of her words that you disagree with the accuracy, you focus on that which is true. And you use ownership language. You say, you're right. You're absolutely right. I did that. And that was wrong. And it damaged you. Now, the strange part of the literature is the measurable power of the opposite of defensiveness. You could call the opposite of defensiveness ownership or confessing instead of defending. And I want to show you what that confession has in the literature. Because most men think of confession as just pure cost with no benefit. But the data says otherwise. James Pennebaker at the University of Texas ran a simple experiment and then ran variations of this same experiment for decades. Here was the experiment. Have people write about their most guarded experiences, their deepest secrets, for 15 or 20 minutes a day for a few days in a journal. Control groups write about their shoes or their day or very neutral things, and then track the health of the two groups. The expressive writing groups that were confessing their secrets had fewer doctor visits and better biomarkers of health across all ranges of studies. When you put the unsaid, unconfessed truth into words, even privately in your journal, on paper where no one reads it, it changed the physiology of the person. And I'm not sure if anyone fully knows the mechanism behind this or why it works as well as it does. The mechanism, arguments are still going on in the journals today. I just know that the direction of the finding has held up for 40 years now, and it points the same way that this whole teaching points. Michael Slepian's research group studies secrecy itself, and their findings flipped an assumption that I had carried my whole life. The cost of a secret is mostly not the active hiding. It's not those tense moments of nearly getting caught. Those are rare, but they do happen. The real cost of secrecy is the carrying of the secret. Your mind returns to that secret over and over again. While you're in the shower, while you're on your commute, while you're trying to go to sleep at night. And that repetitive load correlates with worse well-being across their studies. Now connect that to defensiveness, because that link is heavy. A man who is still hiding anything cannot become non-defensive. And the reason has nothing to do with his willpower. Every conversation might lead to a secret being revealed, and so he feels like he's got to guard every doorway. He's carrying a shield with him in every conversation. When I meet a man whose defensiveness won't budge after months of working on his integrity, I stop reaching for more technique and I start asking, what are you keeping secret? What is the shield still protecting? In the world of recovery, 12-step programs have been running this experiment at scale long before these journals did. The 12 steps put confession at step 5, which is admitting to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And 12-step fellowships have a century of data on what happens to the men who skip step 5. Old-timers will tell you clearly, the ones who never do a real 5th step will drink or act out again. Or they stay dry, but they stay defensive, which the program has a phrase for, white-knuckling it. Murray Bowen, who is a family systems researcher, called the capacity to not get defensive differentiation. And what he meant by differentiation is holding on to yourself while staying in emotional contact with someone who is upset with you. Bowen's school has a diagnostic phrase that I really can't think of an improvement on. They called it borrowed functioning, a self that is propped up on someone else's appraisal. That is, my value is found in what you think of me. So when a husband is running on borrowed functioning, he panics every time his partner is upset because her anger is a judgment on his worth. He's borrowing her functioning. He's not differentiated. Where did the shield come from? You didn't build it last weekend. You built the shield in childhood as a safety mechanism. And you know what? It worked. It got you out of trouble on many occasions. But the skill that saved you during childhood is killing your marriage. Here's the picture. Your defensiveness is an old bodyguard. It was hired by your 9-year-old self. And that bodyguard probably kept that boy safe and alive in ways that you've never fully acknowledged. But no one ever told that boy that the war is over. So now as a grown man, you tackle everyone who approaches you, including your wife who's trying to hand you her wound. You don't have to hate that bodyguard, but you do have to retire him because his threat assessment is decades out of date, and the person he keeps hurting is your wife. This brings me back to Daniel and his question. There are marriages where a partner, in the midst of a trauma response, will say things that are cruel. I'm not going to pretend that category doesn't exist. I'm also not going to go into your kitchen with a whistle and be the referee of who is causing the other person harm. The far more likely truth for Daniel is that your wife's words are appropriately sized to the wound that you caused. When she uses the word monster, that is the only word in her vocabulary that is big enough for the wound that she's carrying. And this is the part that Daniel needs the most. It doesn't matter if her words are 10% too big or they're exactly right. Here's what does matter. Every defense that you give that wins the point loses the person. Every single one of them. And haven't you lost enough? Hasn't she lost enough?
Thank you for listening to Joy Recovery Radio. If today's episode was helpful, you can find additional educational resources and information about the Joy Recovery Academy at joy-recovery.com. Remember, joy is possible when you live in integrity.